I thought I was welcoming my in-laws with open arms, but they treated me like an outsider from the start. One day, after a heartbreaking argument, they took everything I had and forced me into bankruptcy. They didn't know I was building a plan to make them pay, but I had to wait for the right moment. "You'll never be one of us." The words hit me like cold water thrown across my face. I was standing in the middle of Livia Corin's dining room, my hands wrapped around a ceramic serving dish that I had spent the better part of 6 hours preparing. Braised lamb with herbs from her own garden because I had researched what she liked. Because that was what I did. I researched, I planned, I gave everything I had to make people feel cared for. The dish was still warm. Steam curled up from it in slow, lazy spirals. And Livia just stood there, arms crossed, chin lifted, watching me with those sharp gray eyes that never seemed to blink. "Excuse me," I said, my voice came out quieter than I intended. "You heard me?" She didn't raise her voice, she never needed to. "Effort doesn't buy belonging, Amara. You can cook 100 dinners and it won't change what you are." I turned to Dorian, my husband, the man I had loved for 4 years and married 2 years prior. He was sitting at the head of the table, the same table I had helped set 3 hours ago with his mother's good silver. He was looking at the tablecloth. "Dorian," my voice broke just slightly on his name. He didn't look up. That silence was worse than anything Livia had said. It filled the room like a gas leak, invisible but suffocating. I felt it press against my chest and I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, to not let them see anything crack. My tendency to go cold when I was hurting had always been a shield and a problem in equal measure. I became too controlled, too internal, too wrapped up in the architecture of my own thinking to let anything out. Right then I stood perfectly still while something inside me started to split down the middle. Amara Vale was 34 years old, a woman who had always expressed love through precision and planning, who had grown up learning that if you worked hard enough and cared enough and gave enough, eventually people would let you in. That belief had followed her into adulthood like a shadow. Her flaw was the quiet obsession underneath the calm surface, the need to control outcomes, the desperate hunger for acceptance that she would never once admit out loud. She was meticulous and self-contained and deeply, privately afraid that no matter what she did, she would always end up standing exactly where she was standing now. The dining room of the Corin family house was all dark wood and heavy furniture and the particular kind of stillness that old money builds around itself. Livia had lived in that house for 30 years and every corner of it reflected her will. Dorian had grown up in those rooms and learned, as children often do, that survival meant agreement. "The accounts are what I want to talk about," Livia said. She moved to the sideboard and picked up a folder. She set it on the table with a flat sound, not quite a slam but close enough. "Sit down." "I don't think I want to sit down right now," I said. "Amara," Dorian finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "Just sit, let's just talk through this calmly." Calmly, I repeated, I heard the thinness in my own voice. "Right." I set the serving dish down, I sat. Livia opened the folder and pushed documents across the table toward me. Papers, several of them, some with dense legal text, others with numbers arranged in columns. I leaned forward and started reading, and at first the words didn't organize themselves into any meaning I recognized. Loan documents, account transfers, authorization signatures. I scanned the signature lines because that was where my eye went almost involuntarily. And there was my name. Amara Vale. Written in my handwriting. Except I had never signed those documents in my life. "What is this?" I asked. My voice had gone very quiet, that deep, cold quiet that meant I was frightened. "Those," Livia said, sitting down across from me and folding her hands, "are records of the financial decisions you have been making with Dorian's resources." "I didn't sign these. The bank has records that say otherwise." "Livia," I looked at her, "I did not sign these documents." "Are you calling me a liar?" Her voice stayed perfectly level. "I'm telling you the truth." I turned to Dorian. "Dorian, look at me, I did not sign these." He rubbed the back of his neck, he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Amara, we've been having some financial problems, you know that. We need to figure out a path forward together." "There is no path forward together if my signature has been forged on loan documents." I pushed the papers back toward the center of the table. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against my thighs so neither of them could see. "How much?" Livia folded the papers back into the folder with the careful movements of a woman who had been waiting a long time for this particular moment. "Enough," she said, "that your credit is finished, and the liability is yours." I sat with that for a moment. The full weight of it took a few seconds to reach me, the way a very bad cut doesn't hurt immediately. The joint accounts. The loans in my name, the signatures I never gave. My savings account, which I had built carefully over 8 years of working, was connected to our joint account, and I knew with a dropping certainty what I was going to find when I checked it. "You planned this," I said. The words came out flat and certain. Livia didn't deny it, she just looked at me. "Get out of my house," she said. She said my house, not our house, not Dorian's house. And Dorian sat there while his mother told his wife to get out of her house, and he looked at the tablecloth again. I packed 2 bags. I moved with the mechanical efficiency of someone in shock, folding things, placing them in the bags, zipping the bags. Livia stood in the doorway of the bedroom and watched me with an expression I couldn't name at first. It took me until I was walking past her toward the front door to understand what I was seeing on her face. Satisfaction. Not anger, not relief, not discomfort or guilt or even indifference. Pure quiet satisfaction. That was when I understood. This had been structured. This had been planned with the same care I put into a dinner party, except that every element of it had been designed to destroy me. The marriage itself might have been a mechanism. I stopped thinking about it because if I let myself go too far into that thought then I would not be able to walk out the door with any control left, and I needed my control. I needed it more than I had ever needed anything. I walked out. I did not look back. I found out the full scope over the next 3 weeks. The joint accounts had been drained over a period of 8 months. The loans taken in my name totaled a sum that made me sit down on the floor of the borrowed room I was staying in and press my forehead against my knees. My credit score was a ruin. There were collection notices forwarded from an address I barely recognized anymore. A bankruptcy filing was not a choice that remained open to me. It was the only legal option I had for managing the damage, and even that was going to cost me years. I spent 2 days in a place that I would describe, looking back, as something like grief. Not the soft kind, the hard, airless kind that sits on your sternum and makes ordinary tasks feel like lifting stone. On the 3rd day, I got up early and I made a list. I am a planner by nature. Grief for me eventually converts into architecture. I listed everything I knew, everything I didn't know yet, and the space between the two. That space was where I would have to work. I took a job under my maiden name Vale at an administrative firm 40 minutes from where I had been living. Modest pay, modest hours, modest everything. Exactly what I needed because I could not afford to be visible. Nights belong to research. I have a tendency to become obsessive when I am working on something important, and I knew this about myself, and I let it happen because there was nothing else to hold onto. I bought books on financial law. I watched court documents from fraud cases. I learned the difference between civil and criminal liability for forgery, the specific evidentiary requirements for proving financial fraud, the way tax filings and business registration documents could be cross-referenced to expose hidden debt structures. I made notes in a system only I understood. I filled notebooks. I started over when the notebooks got too messy. Months passed, 1 then 3 then 6. I didn't reach out to anyone from my old life, not even the few people I had genuinely liked. Trust had become something I couldn't afford, and I knew my inability to trust was becoming its own problem, the way a muscle gets tight and then starts pulling things out of alignment. A woman at my new job named Saren Hale tried to be friendly, and for 3 months I was so guarded with her that she must have thought I actively disliked her. "You know," Saren said one afternoon, placing a coffee on my desk without being asked, "you don't have to explain anything to me, but you're allowed to have a conversation without it costing you something." I looked at the coffee, then at her. "I appreciate the coffee," I said carefully. She laughed, a small easy sound. "That's a start." Saren was 29, detail-oriented in the way that financial analysts tend to be, and she had a kind of quiet empathy that she wore lightly without pressing it on people. She didn't push. She just made herself available in small ways and let me decide what to do with that. It took me another 2 months before I told her anything real. By the end of the first year, I had traced something significant. The Coran family business, a mid-sized property development company that Livia had built and Dorian nominally co-ran, had the outward appearance of stability. Brick and glass buildings, a decent portfolio, a polished website. Underneath, when you knew where to look, and I had spent a year learning exactly where to look, the structure was compromised in several directions at once. There were loans that didn't appear in the public filings the way they should have. There were partner agreements that seemed designed to obscure the actual ownership of certain assets. There were tax filings that, when compared to the transaction records I had started to piece together from various public and semi-public sources, showed gaps that would be very interesting to the right auditor. They had ruined me to protect a collapsing empire. My destroyed credit, my fraudulent debts, they had served some purpose in their financial shell game. I had been a resource to be used and then discarded before the whole thing came down. Knowing that helped me, it made the anger cleaner and the purpose sharper. At the start of the second year, I made a mistake that nearly cost me everything. I had located a former business partner of Livia's, a man named Gregor Taine, who had parted ways with the Corrins under circumstances that were publicly described as amicable and that every piece of evidence I had found suggested were anything but. I arranged to meet him under the pretense of a business consultation, planning to see whether he had documentation I could use. I was careful. I had prepared. What I had not prepared for was Dorian. He was in the same restaurant. By coincidence, or so I told myself at first, though I learned later it was not coincidence at all. He saw me before I saw him, and by the time I registered his presence I was already halfway to the table where Gregor Taine was sitting. Amara, Dorian was beside me. He looked worse than I remembered, thinner, gray around the eyes. "Can we talk?" "I'm meeting someone," I said. My voice came out like a door closing. "I just want 10 minutes, please." He reached out as if he might touch my arm and I stepped back. "Don't," I said. "Amara, I know what happened was, I know I didn't protect you the way I should have." "Dorian," I turned to face him fully. You sat there while your mother told me I would never belong. You sat there while forged documents with my name on them were put on the table. You sat there while she told me to leave. 10 minutes isn't going to cover what you didn't do." He flinched. "Good. I'm asking for a chance to explain," he said. "I'm asking you to walk away right now," I said, "because if you don't, I will cause a scene in this restaurant that neither of us wants." He walked away. My hands were shaking when I sat down across from Gregor Taine. I wrapped them around the water glass and focused on being still, and I missed the first thing he said entirely. "I'm sorry," I said. "Could you repeat that?" He looked at me for a moment. I said, "I'm wondering whether you're here for the same reason I think you're here." That meeting changed things. But it also almost destroyed everything because I let my anger make me move faster than I should have. In the month that followed, still shaken by seeing Dorian, still raw in a way I hadn't expected, I pushed too hard on a contact I'd been developing carefully. I sent a message that was too direct, too revealing of what I actually knew and how I knew it. The contact went quiet. I lost 3 months of carefully built trust in a single impatient moment. "You're doing it again," Saren said. We were at her kitchen table with my notebooks spread between us. She had become, over the course of a year and a half, the only person I trusted with any of this. She had proven herself in small ways repeatedly until I had run out of reasons to keep her at a distance. "Doing what?" I asked, though I already knew. "You get close to something important and you move too fast. You want it done." She tapped the notebook where I had mapped the business connections. "This can't be rushed, you know that." "I know that," I agreed. "So stop acting like you don't." I sat with that. "My mother used to say I had an impatient soul in a patient body," I said. Saren looked up. She was right. I had to rebuild the contact network almost from scratch. I was more careful this time. Slower. The anger was still there, but I had learned to keep it in the back room behind a closed door where it could fuel things without driving them. Then I found Elias Vorn. Elias was 45, a legal advisor who described himself as pragmatic, and who I would have described as someone who genuinely enjoyed watching large fraudulent structures get dismantled, not for any grand moral reason, but because the process itself appealed to him. He had a sharp, restless intelligence, and a reputation for taking cases that other attorneys found too complex or too unglamorous. He was expensive even with the reduced rate he offered me once he'd reviewed what I had. "This is workable," he said at our first meeting, spreading the documents across his own table with practiced hands. "This is genuinely workable." "I need to know the realistic timeline," I said. "Realistic is 12 to 18 months to get to the point where the audit request carries real teeth." He looked up. "Can you hold for that long?" "I've been holding for 2 years," I said. "I can hold longer." "There's another thing," he steepled his fingers. "Some of the most damaging material, the forged signatures specifically, those are strong in a civil proceeding, but what would really accelerate the criminal side is something from inside the operation. A witness, documents that didn't pass through external hands." "I understand," I said. "Do you have anyone like that?" I thought of every person connected to the Corrin business that I had cataloged. I thought of the family. I thought of who might be watching the same things I was watching from the inside. "Not yet," I said. I kept building. The legal notices arrived on a Tuesday morning and I was 300 miles away when they did. Elias called me. "They've been served," he said. I closed my eyes for a moment. "The audit request is formal and on record," he continued. "The civil suit is filed. The package I sent to the relevant tax authority is in the right hands. It begins now." "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet." He was right about that. Livia Corin did not accept things quietly. Within 48 hours, she had her own legal team making calls. Within a week, a communication arrived through Elias' office that was phrased politely and meant as a threat. I read it twice and filed it. 2 weeks after the notices were served, Livia called Dorian into her office, which I knew because Saren had a contact who was adjacent to the business and who had started, carefully and without commitment, passing small pieces of information in exchange for the kind of consideration that Elias managed in legal and financial terms. Not the inside source I had hoped for, but useful. "She's trying to move assets," Saren told me. "She's been making transfers." "Elias already has a motion prepared for that," I said. "She can try." But it was the movement of assets that gave us the additional documentation we needed to file for a freezing order. That was the moment when the shape of the whole thing became visible to me for the first time, the way a building becomes visible in fog when the light finally comes through. I had built this structure piece by piece in the dark for 2 years. Now I could see it standing. The confrontation came on a Thursday. Livia and Dorian came to Elias' office. I had not planned for this. Elias had not quite planned for it either. Though he managed to look completely unperturbed when his receptionist informed him they were in the lobby. "You want to meet with them?" he asked me. "Yes," I said, which was the part where my obsessive need to be present for the conclusion overrode the part of me that knew I should probably let Elias handle it professionally. Saren had warned me about this. She had said, specifically, that I needed to let the legal process do the work and not put myself in a room where my emotions could make things complicated. I put myself in the room. Livia looked the same. That was the first thing I noticed. Controlled and composed and carrying her authority the way she always had, like clothing she had worn so long it had become skin. Dorian looked diminished. He stood slightly behind his mother in a way that suddenly looked very young to me, like a man who had been a boy for his entire life. "Amara," Livia's voice was perfectly level. "This performance has gone far enough." "Sit down, Livia," I said. "This isn't a performance." She didn't sit. "You want what exactly?" "Money, because I can tell you right now that a settlement." "I don't want a settlement." "Then what do you want?" She said it with the faint contempt of someone who genuinely cannot imagine a motivation outside a financial transaction. "Accountability," I said. Livia made a short sound that was almost a laugh. "Accountability, from a woman who spent 2 years quietly building a case out of grievance." "Out of evidence," I said. "There's a difference." Dorian said, "Amara, please, we can work something out, you don't have to." "Dorian," I looked at him, just at him for a full second, the way you look at someone you are finally finished grieving. "I want to ask you something and I want you to answer me honestly for once in your life. Did you know what she was planning before it happened?" He said nothing. "Did you know they were going to forge my signatures?" He said nothing. "Did you sit there at that table knowing what those documents were and what was going to happen to me after I walked out?" Dorian looked at the floor. "That," I said, "is all the answer I need." Livia stepped forward. "You have no idea the kind of legal resources I can bring to bear on this, whatever little collection of documents you've assembled." "Elias," I said. Elias opened the second folder on the table. He laid out 11 documents. He explained each one in the calm, precise manner of a man who had spent 20 years dealing with precisely this kind of situation. Tax filings against transaction records, loan documentation against public filings, partnership agreements showing hidden liability structures. And at the center of it, the forged signatures, my name in someone else's careful reproduction of my handwriting, attached to financial instruments that had been used to systematically drain and redirect money from accounts I had shared legally with Dorian. Livia's composure didn't crack that I had expected, but something shifted in her face, something tightened. "You've been busy," she said. "I had time," I said. "You made sure of that." "This will be contested." "Of course it will be," Elias said pleasantly. "We're counting on that." "You think a civil suit is going to destroy us?" Livia turned the full force of her gaze on me. It was a practiced look designed to make people feel small. I had felt it work on me before. Standing across from her now, with 2 years of evidence built into the table between us, it felt like weather, unpleasant but not dangerous. The civil suit is only part of it, I said. The tax authority investigation runs independently. The audit doesn't need my testimony to proceed. The fraudulent loan documentation is already in the hands of the relevant financial regulatory body, and the asset transfers you initiated 2 weeks ago are currently the subject of a freezing application that Elias expects to be granted by end of week. Livia was silent. You built something on bad foundations, I said. And when the foundations started to crack, you looked for something to throw into the gap. That was me. You used me to buy yourselves time, and now the time is up. Amara, her voice had changed, still controlled but thinner. Whatever you think happened. I don't think I documented, I gathered myself. I had imagined this moment for 2 years, and now that I was in it, I felt very little of what I had expected. No triumph, no rage, just a strange, clear tiredness. I'm not asking you for anything, I'm informing you that the process is already in motion. There's nothing to negotiate. Dorian said very quietly, Mom, we should go. And here is where my flaw showed itself. Because I had been so careful, so controlled for so long, and being in that room with both of them was doing something to the door I had kept shut at the back of everything. I felt it straining. Wait, I said. They both paused. I want you to know, I said, and my voice came out less steady than I wanted, that for a long time I thought I had done something wrong. That if I had been different, better, more of whatever you wanted, none of this would have happened. I cooked dinners, I learned your preferences, I studied what your family liked. I thought love was something you earned through effort. I breathed. I was wrong about that, and watching me believe that while you were planning this, that was the cruelest part of what you did, not the money. Not the credit, the fact that you let me keep trying while you were already finished with me. Livia looked at me for a long moment, and then she said very quietly, you were never going to be enough. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. I let them leave. The asset freezing order was granted on Friday. The business accounts were frozen the following Monday. The tax investigation, which had been moving at the slow, thorough pace of institutional bureaucracy, accelerated once the audit documentation was formally received and cross-referenced. What followed over the next 4 months was not dramatic. It was procedural and comprehensive and devastating. The Corin property development business lost 3 major contracts as the investigation became public record. Their lending relationships dried up. The hidden partnership structures, once exposed to scrutiny, revealed liabilities that made the business effectively insolvent. By the time the civil judgment was handed down, there was very little left to seize. Livia's reputation, which had been built carefully over 30 years in a community where reputation functioned as currency, collapsed in a way that I found I had no pleasure in watching. I had expected to feel something watching it happen. What I felt instead was a kind of hollow distance. I had been right, I had been thorough, I had done what needed to be done. And I was standing in my small apartment, safe and solvent and alone, and I didn't know what to do with the silence. Dorian tried to call me twice. I let it go to voicemail both times. The second message was 4 minutes long. I listened to it once, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of tea going cold beside me, and I felt the grief that I had been keeping in the back room move forward a few steps, not for what had happened, for what I had wanted the marriage to be, for the version of Dorian I had believed in for 4 years before I understood who he actually was. I didn't call back. Saren came over that evening with food she had cooked, which was her way of taking care of people, and we sat at my kitchen table and didn't talk about any of it for a while. How are you actually doing? She asked eventually. I'm not sure yet, I said. That's honest. I thought it would feel like something, I said. I thought there would be a point where it felt finished. Maybe it doesn't feel finished because it isn't quite yet, she said. Not for you. I thought about that. 3 weeks later, Elias called me about a letter. Something came through the legal correspondence that I think you need to see, he said. He didn't explain further, which was unlike him. I drove to his office that afternoon. The letter was in a standard envelope addressed to Elias' firm. Inside was a single page and a small collection of photocopied documents. The letter itself was brief and had been written on a word processor, printed and signed by hand. The handwriting was careful, slightly cramped, the writing of someone who was being very deliberate about legibility. I read it standing at Elias' desk. The letter explained that the writer had been present during several of the financial decisions made by Livia Corin over the preceding 4 years. The writer had documented certain transactions and communications that had not been accessible through public records or the standard audit process. Several of these documents were attached. The letter explained that the writer had been unable to act sooner for reasons that were described briefly and without self-pity. The writer said only that they had been watching and that they had been waiting for the moment when their contribution could matter. The letter was signed. I stared at the signature for a long time. Petra Koren, Livia's younger sister. A woman I had met exactly 3 times in the years of my marriage, a quiet woman in her late 50s who attended family events at the periphery and left early and never seemed to be entirely present. I had barely thought about her. She had barely spoken at any gathering I could remember. She had always seemed like one of those people who move through spaces without occupying them. But she had been watching. She had been documenting. She had been, in her quiet way, doing exactly what I was doing, waiting for the moment when the evidence would be enough and the structure would be exposed. "Did you know?" I asked Elias. "I received a package from her 6 months ago," he said carefully. "She reached out anonymously at first. 3 of the documents in the case that I described to you as coming from a source I couldn't name, those came from her." I sat down. 6 months? She had been contributing for 6 months, and I had been working in what I believed was near complete isolation, and all along there had been someone inside the family who had seen what Livia was and had quietly chosen the same side I was on. I thought about what it must have cost her. Living inside that family, watching what was done, keeping records in secret, waiting. The particular loneliness of being a witness to something wrong and having no way to act on it except in small, hidden, patient movements. "Does she want anything from me?" I asked. Elias hesitated. "She asked only that you know she saw what happened to you. She said that if you ever wanted to make contact she would welcome it, but she made no demands." I folded the letter. I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I had spent 2 years building the belief that I had been entirely alone, that belonging was something that had been permanently taken from me along with my savings and my credit and my marriage. The architecture of my isolation had become so familiar that I had started to mistake it for truth. I had thought, this is what I am now, someone who works alone and trusts no one and needs nothing from anyone. And here was a woman who had sat at the same tables I had sat at in the same rooms, watching the same things, and had made a different choice than the rest of them. She had been a quiet rebellion in a family that allowed none. I had not been entirely alone. I had simply not known who to look for. I called Saren that evening. "I need to tell you something," I said. "I'm listening," she said. I told her about the letter. I told her about Petra. I told her about the particular feeling of having been seen by someone you never knew was watching. Saren listened without interrupting, which was one of her best qualities. When I finished, she said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to write her back," I said. "Good," Saren said. The letter I wrote to Petra Koren took me 4 drafts and 2 evenings. In the final version, I told her that I had received her letter. I told her I understood something of what it must have cost her. I told her that I had spent 2 years believing that the price of belonging was compliance and that I had been wrong, that belonging wasn't something you purchased through effort or silence or endurance. I told her that what she had done, the watching and the waiting and the choosing, was the first genuinely generous thing anyone connected to that family had ever given me. I said that if she ever wanted to have coffee and talk, I would genuinely like that. I mailed it. 2 weeks later, she responded. 1 page, handwritten this time in that careful, cramped script. She said she had been watching Livia for a long time. She said she was sorry she hadn't acted sooner. She said she would very much like to have coffee. We met in a neutral place, a small cafe that neither of us had any connection to, and she was quieter in person than I had imagined from her letters. She ordered tea and held the cup with both hands and looked at me across the table with gray eyes that I now recognized as a family trait worn differently, without the edge, without the calculation. "I want you to know," she said, "that what happened to you was not an accident and it was not the first time." "I suspected that," I said. "There were others," she said quietly, "not as severe, but yes." I took that in. "Why did you stay?" I asked her, not with judgment, just wanting to understand. She was quiet for a moment, because leaving felt like another thing she would win, and because I thought if I stayed I might one day be able to do something that mattered. She looked at her tea. "It took longer than I wanted." "It always does," I said. We sat with that for a while. I would not say that what I felt in the weeks after that meeting was happiness exactly. Happiness felt too bright a word for where I was. What I felt was more like ground underfoot after a long time of not being sure there was ground at all. Stable, real, a thing you could stand on. My credit was rebuilding, slowly but measurably. The civil judgment had partially restored the financial damage, not all of it. Some of that was simply gone, but enough that the worst of the weight had lifted. The bankruptcy was in the past. My work, the modest administrative job I had taken under my maiden name, had grown into something I had not expected. A role with more responsibility, more complexity, more of the planning and precision that I was genuinely good at. Saren had become, without ceremony or announcement, my closest friend, which was strange to me because I was not naturally someone who made close friends and had gone 2 years actively preventing it. She had simply refused to accept the distance I offered and had been patient and consistently herself until I stopped maintaining the walls as a point of principle. Elias had sent me a bottle of wine with a card that said, in his efficient way, "Well done." I had appreciated that. Petra and I met for coffee 3 more times over the following months. She was rebuilding her own life, quietly and on her own terms, at a remove from the family business that had now effectively ceased to exist. She had a dry humor I hadn't expected, and a way of observing things that suggested she had been looking at the world from the outside of things for so long that she had developed very clear eyes about it. One afternoon she said to me, "Did you get what you wanted from all of this?" I thought about it for a real moment. "I got what needed to happen," I said. "I'm not sure if that's the same as what I wanted." "What did you want?" she asked. "I think I wanted it to mean something to them," I said. "I wanted there to be a moment where they understood what they'd done and felt the weight of it." I paused. "I don't think that happened. I don't think people like Livia have that moment. She probably still believes she was right." Petra said, "She does." She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. "Then what was the point?" I asked, not entirely seriously. Petra looked at me. "The point was that you're here and she's not," she said simply. "The point was that you kept going when they expected you not to. The point was that you didn't become what they made of you." I looked at my coffee. "I became pretty isolated," I said, "pretty suspicious, pretty cold for a while." "For a while," she said, "and then you wrote me back." I thought about all the ways my own nature had complicated what I had done. The obsessive planning that had kept me going and also nearly cost me the contact network when I pushed too hard. The control that had helped me stay calm in that office with Livia and Dorian, and had also kept me from letting anyone close for 2 years longer than I needed to. The impatience that had blown up a careful relationship in a moment of grief-driven anger, and cost me 3 months of work. My flaws had been threaded through every part of this the same way they were threaded through everything I did. The revenge had not been clean. It had been human and flawed and costly in ways that I was still understanding. But I was here. I was still here. And on the other side of all of it, I had Saren and Petra and Elias and a modest life that was mine in a way nothing had been mine for years. I had the evidence of my own persistence. I had, unexpectedly, an ally I hadn't known to look for. What I had learned and what I turned over in my mind on quiet evenings was that the thing they had taken most successfully was not the money or the credit or even the marriage. It was the belief that I could trust anyone, that belonging was real, that kindness and effort meant something. Rebuilding the financial loss had taken 2 years of hard work. Rebuilding the belief had taken longer and was still in progress. But it was in progress. And some mornings I woke up and made coffee and looked out the window of my small apartment, the one that was safe and stable and entirely mine, and felt something quiet and unshowy that I could, with some accuracy, call okay. Not whole, not finished, not rid of the obsessive streak or the trust issues or the cold impatience that could still flare up when I was scared or cornered. But okay. And for someone who had been left responsible for ruins that weren't hers, who had packed 2 bags under a satisfied woman's watchful gaze, who had sat on the floor of a borrowed room and pressed her forehead to her knees while the full scope of what had been done to her settled in, okay was not nothing. Okay was, in fact, a great deal.